During a job interview, it often can be challenging to decide on whether you should exhibit backbone or not while answering interview questions. And that's why in this video I'm going to share with you a number of questions and then decide what's the best approach to answer them. Right? Scenario number one, question number one, a time when you disagreed with a colleague. Okay, so what type of environment is this? An environment where you should exhibit obedience, so to speak, that you're a non-conflictual person, you very much like to avoid them, you're a very likable person, and you never had any major conflicts throughout your career, or maybe you should focus on an example where you did have a disagreement with a colleague, and eventually you took some decisions and some steps towards resolving the conflict. Okay, so it's obviously the second scenario where you should focus on specific examples when you diffused conflicts with colleagues. Even further, most of you will want to speak about a functional type of conflict. Functional conflict means a conflict around your area of expertise. Right? If you're an accountant, you disagree over some formula to, I don't know, to compute some transfer pricing thing, or some import taxes. But long story short, disagreement with a colleague is a classic scenario where you should rather go towards the backbone side, right? Where you had a disagreement, and yes, you could even be right in these situations if you come up with the right data and you communicate this efficiently, right? So a scenario where you disagree with a colleague. Another scenario would be what time when you disagree with your manager, with your boss. So should your approach change while answering these types of questions? Should you exhibit more or less backbone in these situations? No, it's actually the same thing. Whether you disagree with a colleague or with your manager or with your skip, it's the same approach. Focus on functional conflicts, right? Now let's take some more interesting examples here. We do not make the right decision or the right judgment call all the time. Tell me about the time when you had made a bad decision. Okay, so what's the best way to answer this interview question? Is it best to answer it with something on the lines of, yeah, I did a small mistake here, but I quickly corrected it. So basically, I tend not to make mistakes, and I do not the type of person who makes mistakes. Or should you answer it with something on the lines of, hey, you know what, yes, it does happen that I made a mistake, and which I assumed, and then you would go on with your answer. So which of these two scenarios would be the most likely to sell yourself as best candidate during a job interview? Okay, it's obviously the second one, right? It's the classic, tell me about the time when you failed, when you would want to exhibit an example of a time when you actually failed, and actually focus the way you sell yourself in these answers is with the learnings that you took from that failure scenario, right? So this was the second example I want to talk about here. The third example, tell me about the time when you had to commit to a decision even though you disagreed with the decision. Okay, so should you talk about a time when you committed to a decision, or should you talk about a time when you somewhat committed but not really, because you proved the other person that you had a better idea maybe? Okay, so you should answer the question of a time when you committed to a decision that you disagreed with. Okay, now there's a small remark here that you should talk about the decision to which you committed, which ultimately turned out to be the right decision, right? So for example, if you disagree with your manager over something, but you decide to commit because you have to commit, ultimately, if you say that, hey, but in the end I was still right, but I had to commit because he's my boss, that would be a big mistake, right? For the purpose of job interviews. Okay, next example. Tell me about the time when you decided something without consulting your boss. Okay, so should you talk about the time when you exhibited backbone? Hey, I could do it without my boss? Or should you talk about, hey, yes, I did a mistake by not consulting my boss? Right, so to answer this, you must understand why the question gets asked in the first place. And the reason why someone would ask you a time when you decided something without consulting your boss would be that you had likely had to take that decision very quickly. Right, so you didn't have time to consult with your boss for the purpose. And if you understand why the question gets asked, then it's a lot easier for you to give the proper answer. Okay. Next example. Let's say you present a situation, you're a developer, and you present an algorithm that you did to do some complex computations, okay, for your customers. And those complex computations resolve very well, but it takes 2 seconds for the customer to see the results. And then your interviewer would ask you something online. Okay, but are you sure it's the right way to go? I mean, 2 seconds for the customer to wait for this data seems like a lot. Maybe you could have implemented a better algorithm, right? So should you agree or disagree with this approach? And the answer is a bit, maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't, because what happens is that if you implemented that algorithm that takes 2 seconds to compute for the customer isn't bothered by those 2 seconds it takes to load the data, and implementing a much better algorithm would take you 3 months, then probably it was the right call. But you should focus on explaining your way of doing things and answering why the scenario that they're suggesting might not be, or maybe even better than what you have said in your answer. So this type of test is also called the backbone test. In other words, they are challenging you on stuff. So maybe to see whether you are the type who agrees for social cohesion, or they can easily change your mind because you cannot think on your feet, so to speak, right? So this was the backbone test, right? And maybe let's take one more here. How do you handle conflicts with colleagues or with your boss? Okay, so it's slightly different for a time when you disagreed with someone. Someone asks you this direct question, or how do you deal with someone who does not like you? Can be quite direct as an interview question. How would you go around answering this? Would you want to exhibit backbone in this? Say, hey, if someone doesn't like me, maybe I'm going to take some steps for it. Or would you go something along the lines of, I'm a very non-conflictual person, so I like to avoid these conflicts, and throughout my career I never had any major conflicts. Okay, so how would you go around this? So the answer would be on the same lines of the first questions I presented you with, the time when you disagreed with someone. Because if I frame the question, how do you deal with someone who does not like you? That's the same as how do you deal with someone when you disagree with a colleague, which is exactly the same thing as if I ask you, tell me about how do you deal with functional conflicts for most roles, right? So functional conflicts, you'll think about the time when you disagree with someone over subject matter expertise and how you eventually took the data and communicated properly in order to bring in some cohesion and to resolve that functional conflict, which would easily qualify as if someone did not like you, which would be a dramatization, that interviewers use in these job interviews, because nowadays it's quite easy for candidates to predict the questions you're going to get as this job interview. So these interviewers have to get a bit more creative, to reframe a little, to dramatize, or to open-end, or to make those questions hypothetical, so it's not as obvious for you as to what they're asking, right? But reading a little bit between the lines is of great help when it comes to deciding what's the best course of action to answer, whether to exhibit backbone or maybe, to show a bit more commitment for these job interviews. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.